What happens when betrayal strikes at your most vulnerable moment?
Sarah, wait.
Eleanor loses her mother, her
Please, just
marriage,
let me
and her
explain what
closest
happened
friend,
here.
all in a single day. But instead of breaking, something inside her transforms. This isn't just a story about revenge. It's about identity, resilience, and discovering your true worth when everyone else underestimates you.
She caught them in the bathroom during her own mother's funeral service. It was her husband with her best friend of 15 years. She was 7 months pregnant, just standing there, watching her life shatter before her eyes. He demanded a divorce, telling her she was broke and could never win in court. He thought she had nothing. But he was wrong about her secret. A secret her adoptive mother, a frugal woman who drove an old car, had kept for 32 years. It was a secret worth $1.3 trillion. They treated her like she was worthless. They laughed at her in her moment of deepest pain. They even attempted to take her child. But the woman they tried to crush was about to become the most powerful person they had ever met. This is the story of Eleanor Whitmore, a pregnant wife betrayed while grieving her mother. It is about a secret fortune that changed everything and a revenge so perfect she barely had to act. You will want to see this through to the end, because what happens to the cheating husband and the fake best friend is unbelievable. This story shows an important truth. Your value is never set by the people who throw you away. Your worth is not determined by those who could not see it. Sometimes losing it all is the only way to find yourself. Sometimes the worst betrayal can bring you the greatest freedom, and sometimes the person everyone looks down on can rise higher than they ever dreamed. If you are going through a difficult time, remember this. The door that closes on you might be opening a new path to an amazing place. Your strength is shown not by what happens to you, but by what you decide to do. You are far stronger than you realize. A soft moan came from behind the bathroom door. Ellie heard her husband's voice, then the voice of her best friend. She froze in the hallway of her childhood home. It was the same hall where she learned to walk, the same hall where her mother, Rose, would playfully chase her. It was the same hall where, just 3 days before, paramedics carried her mother away. Her mother was gone. Cancer took Rose Bellingham when she was 68 years old. And now, during the reception after the service, her husband was with her best friend in the guest bathroom. 50 people were eating sandwiches downstairs. She knew those sounds. She knew both of their voices. Her hand trembled as she reached for the door. A small part of her wanted to run, to pretend she heard nothing and go back to the guests. But Ellie could not make her feet retreat. She could only move forward. The door was unlocked. Grant had Vivian pressed against the bathroom counter. Her black funeral dress was hiked up around her waist. His wedding band gleamed under the light. It was the very same ring Ellie had placed on his finger 6 years ago. For a few seconds, nobody said a word. Then Ellie spoke. Her voice was empty, without any feeling, as if she were reading a grocery list. "My mother is dead," she stated. "She has been gone for 3 days." Grant's face went white. He backed away from Vivian, adjusting his clothes. Vivian's perfect makeup was a mess, and her lipstick stained Grant's collar. "Ellie," Grant started, raising his hands. He looked at her as if she were holding a knife. "Ellie, please be calm. You are pregnant. You have to consider the baby." The baby. As if she could forget about her own child. Her 7-month belly stretched the black maternity dress she wore. It was the same belly Grant had lovingly touched last week while they planned the nursery. Vivian started to weep, perfect tears rolling down her perfect cheeks. "I am so sorry, Ellie," she said, her words sounding practiced. "It was an accident. We never wanted you to discover it like this." Discover it like this? As if there were a correct way. As if there was a scheduled announcement for next week. As if a greeting card existed for this situation. Something inside Ellie just gave way. She felt like she was floating away from her own body. From a spot near the ceiling, she watched the pregnant woman turn and leave the bathroom. She returned to the wake. She smiled at her guests. She accepted a casserole dish from her neighbor, Mrs. Henderson. She nodded when Grant's mother, Lorraine, said that Rose was now in a better place. Her body was on autopilot while her mind was broken. The gathering continued for 3 more hours. Ellie shook more hands. She hugged relatives she hardly recognized. She thanked each person for their support. She did all the things a grieving daughter was meant to do. Grant and Vivian finally reappeared, one after the other, of course. Vivian had fixed her face. Grant had straightened his shirt. They acted like everything was normal, as if Ellie had not seen a thing. At 8:30 that evening, the last of the guests went home. Ellie was in the kitchen, washing the dishes. It was the same kitchen where Rose taught her to bake a pie when she was just 8. It was the same kitchen where Rose had held her when she felt like an outcast at school. It was the same kitchen where Rose said the words that shaped Ellie's life. Family is not about who you are related to, honey. Family is who you choose. Rose had chosen Ellie. She adopted her from a hospital in Columbus. She gave her a family, a name, and a future. And now Rose was gone. Ellie gripped a plate so hard her knuckles turned white. She heard Grant's footsteps approaching from behind her. She knew that sound. It was the arrogant walk of a man who thought he deserved the world. "Ellie," he said, his voice smooth and rehearsed. "We have to discuss our situation." She kept washing the plate. It was completely clean, but she just kept scrubbing. "I have been considering this for a while," Grant continued. "Vivian and this is serious. She just gets me in a way you never did." The plate slipped from Ellie's hands. It landed in the sink with a loud clatter, but it did not break. "The baby was a mistake," Grant said. "We both knew it. We were trying to fix a relationship that was already over." Ellie finally turned around to look at him. She stared at the man she had been married to for 6 years. The man she fell for at a charity gala. The man who wooed her with fancy dates and empty words. The man who wept at their wedding, promising to love her forever. "I want a divorce," Grant declared. "I will be reasonable about the child. We will work it out." A cold, deep voice came from inside Ellie. "Get out!" Grant was taken aback. "Ellie, let's be mature about this." "Get out. Right now. We live in a community property state," he argued. "We have to talk about— Get out of my mother's house, now!" Something in her tone made him step backward. Maybe he finally saw the hollowness in her eyes, the same void she felt in her chest, the place where her heart used to be. Grant took his coat from a hook near the door. He paused on his way out. "I will send someone for my things in the morning. Do not cause any trouble." And with that, he left. Ellie was completely alone in her mother's kitchen. The clock on the wall kept ticking. The refrigerator made a low humming sound. A dog barked somewhere outside. She picked up her phone and called Vivian. It rang 3 times before her so-called best friend answered. "Ellie?" Vivian's voice was cautious and heavy with guilt. "I was just about to phone you. I wanted to try and explain." "How long?" A moment of silence. "What? How long have you been with my husband? How long have you been lying to me?" Vivian let out a shaky sigh. "Ellie, it is not that simple." "How long?" Another silence. Longer this time. 14 months. The number hit Ellie like a physical blow. 14 months. "It started right after your birthday party." Vivian just kept talking. "The one that I threw for you. Grant and I were decorating, and it just kind of happened." The birthday party. The surprise party that had made Ellie feel so loved and special. She had felt so lucky to have such a wonderful husband and a loyal best friend. Ellie quickly did the math. She had announced her pregnancy on Thanksgiving. Grant had seemed so happy. He had picked her up and twirled her around the room. He had called his own mother with the joyous news before Ellie could even catch her breath. But by that Thanksgiving, he had already been with Vivian for 5 months. It was all an act. The excitement on his face, their discussions about the nursery, the baby names they wrote on napkins at brunch, every single one of those moments was a complete lie. "Ellie?" Vivian's voice was soft. "Are you still there?" Ellie hung up the phone without saying anything else. She walked to the bathroom, not the guest bathroom, but the main one. Her mother's bathroom. She sat down on the edge of the tub, still dressed, and turned on the faucet. She did not plan to get in. She just sat there, staring at the tile wall. A cross-stitch from Rose hung in a plain frame. It said, "Home is where they love you." Rose made it when Ellie was only 10 years old. She put that sign in the bathroom of every home they ever had. It was even in their tiny apartment during the tough years. Rose worked 2 jobs then just to keep food on their table. Home is where they love you. Ellie's phone buzzed. A message appeared from Grant. I am sending someone for my things tomorrow. Do not cause a scene. Do not cause a scene. As if this whole disaster was her fault. As if she had wanted this betrayal. As if she were the one being difficult. She sat on the tub's edge while the bathwater grew cold. She finally shut off the water and walked to her childhood bedroom. She lay down on the bed that held her for 1,000 nights. She stared at the ceiling. Rose had painted glow-in-the-dark stars there because Ellie feared the dark. Tears would not come. She was too hollow to cry. This is not a nightmare, she whispered into the silence. This is real, my husband, my best friend, at my own mother's funeral. The stars, painted 25 years ago, gave off a soft green glow above her. The old stars were faded, but they still shone. They always managed to shine. From somewhere in the house, a floorboard creaked. It was just the old house settling, but for a quick second, Ellie imagined it was her mother's footsteps. She pictured Rose coming to check on her like she always did. But Rose was gone for good, and the life Ellie thought she had was gone too. She placed a hand over her belly. The baby kicked, a firm and sudden flutter. The baby was real. She still had that. At least one good thing was left in this awful, broken world. Ellie closed her eyes. She knew she would not sleep, but she shut them anyway. Tomorrow was coming, ready or not. The first light of morning crept through the curtains like an unwanted visitor. Ellie had been awake for hours. She saw the black sky turn to gray and the gray become a pale yellow. She heard the birds begin to sing their morning songs. She felt the baby start its morning stretches. But she did not get out of bed. To get up meant facing the day. To get up meant dealing with the truth. To get up meant accepting her life was built on a terrible lie. Her phone displayed 17 missed calls. 12 of them were from Grant. 5 were from Vivian. She didn't listen to the voicemails. She already knew their contents. They would be filled with weak apologies and flimsy excuses. They would try to twist the facts to make themselves look better. At 9:15, she forced herself to sit up. Her pregnant body ached with each small motion. A dull pain spread across her back. Her feet felt puffy and tight. A headache was pounding behind her eyes from no sleep and no water. She went to the kitchen and made a pot of coffee. It had to be decaf for the baby. Rose's favorite mug was in the dish rack. It was a plain white mug that said "World's Best Mom" in faded letters. Ellie gave it to her for Mother's Day when she was just 7. She poured her coffee into that exact mug. She sat at the small kitchen table. She just stared at nothing. The doorbell rang at 10 o'clock sharp. She saw a man in a moving company uniform through the window. Ellie went to the door. "Mrs. Whitmore?" he asked, holding a clipboard. "I'm here for a pickup. Your husband arranged it." Of course he did. Grant was always so very efficient. "The garage," Ellie said, her voice flat. "His golf clubs are in the garage. That is the only thing he is getting from this house." The mover looked uneasy. "Ma'am, the list I have says several boxes of clothes, electronics, and some furniture. Just the golf clubs. In the garage, that is all," she said again. Something in her tone made the man simply nod. He took the golf clubs and left in under 10 minutes. Ellie watched his truck drive away down the block. She returned to her coffee, which was now cold. The house phone started ringing. It was a landline Rose always kept, even when everyone had cell phones. Ellie almost let it ring, but she saw the name on the caller ID, Theodore Ashford. It was her mother's lawyer. "Mrs. Whitmore?" Theodore's voice was formal yet kind. "I do hope this is an okay time." "It is fine," she said. "I just wanted to offer my condolences again. Your mother was a very remarkable person." "Thank you," Ellie managed to say. A short pause followed. Theodore cleared his throat. "Mrs. Whitmore, we should discuss some matters regarding your mother's estate. Could you possibly come by my office later today?" Her estate? Ellie was baffled. Rose lived a very simple life. She had this little house, a 12-year-old car, and a small retirement account from her job. "I did not think there was much to discuss," Ellie said. There was another pause, this one a little longer. "Mrs. Whitmore, I think it is best we discuss this face-to-face. There are some complications?" Complications? What sort of complications could there be? I can be there at 2 o'clock, Ellie responded. For the next few hours, she just wandered through the silent house. She felt the old, worn fabric on the couch that Rose never wanted to replace. She looked in the pantry, full of generic brand cereal and canned soup. She traced the chips on the kitchen counter that Rose meant to repair someday. Everything in the house told a story of a careful life. It was a story of cutting coupons and shopping for sales. It was the story of a woman who accounted for every single cent. At 1:30, Ellie drove Rose's old Honda to the lawyer's office. The car was still filled with her mother's light perfume of lavender and vanilla. The familiar scent made her chest ache. Theodore's office was in a plain building downtown. It was not a fancy place, but it was dignified. Ellie had been there only once before, years ago, when Rose updated her will just after Ellie's wedding. The receptionist took her directly to Theodore's office. He rose from his chair to greet her. He was a tall man, maybe in his late 50s, with gray hair and gentle eyes behind his glasses. "Please, sit down," he said, gesturing to a chair across from his wide desk. "May I get you a glass of water or some tea?" "No, thank you. I am fine." Theodore sat down again. A large folder lay on his desk. He rested his hands on it as if to guard it. "Mrs. Whitmore, I must ask you something before we begin. Did your mother ever speak of her life before she adopted you?" Ellie simply shook her head. "Not really. She said her childhood was difficult and she left home at 16. She did not like to talk about her birth parents." Theodore gave a slow nod. "That is what I had assumed. Your mother was a very private woman. She had very strong reasons to be." He opened the folder. A letter in Rose's distinct handwriting was inside. He pushed it gently across the desk to her. "She wanted me to give this to you. She wrote it last week when she knew she did not have much time." Ellie's hands shook as she picked up the letter. The writing was weak and unsteady. Rose had been losing strength in her final days. But the words on the page were perfectly clear. "My dearest Eleanor, I have some things to tell you that I should have shared long ago. I was afraid. I feared you might see me in a different light. I was worried you would feel I had deceived you. But I never deceived you, my love. I just omitted certain details. When I brought you into my life, I was already an incredibly wealthy woman. I created a company and then sold it for more money than we both could use in 100 lifetimes. I have held this secret for 32 years. I wanted you to know you were loved for yourself, not for the things I could buy you. Theodore knows the entire story. Please do not hold this against an old woman whose only wish was to be your mom. With all my love, always Rose." Ellie reread the letter 3 times. The words felt like they were from another world. Unimaginably wealthy? More money than they could use in 100 lifetimes? This came from a woman who drove a 12-year-old vehicle and clipped coupons until her hands were too sore to hold the scissors. "I just do not get it," Ellie whispered. Theodore inhaled slowly. "Before your mother adopted you, she founded a pharmaceutical company from nothing. She was a gifted chemist who was entirely self-taught. She developed a medication that completely revolutionized how we handle certain blood disorders," he concluded. "She sold her business at 35, but she retained the patents and made some very shrewd investments." Ellie could only stare at him, completely speechless. A pharmaceutical company? It was among the most profitable new ventures in Ohio's history. She sold it to a massive corporation. Then she spent the next 3 decades quietly expanding that wealth with anonymous investments. She invested in property, technology, and green energy. She held shares in companies you would know instantly. "But she lived in a small house with 3 bedrooms, Ellie said, her voice a faint whisper. "She drove a Honda. She chose to live that way," Theodore clarified. "She could have owned mansions or private airplanes. She could have possessed anything she desired, but she did not want those things. All she ever wanted was a peaceful, normal life with her daughter." Ellie's mind was reeling. None of it seemed remotely possible. It did not seem real. "How much is it?" she finally was able to ask. "What is the total value of the estate?" Theodore looked at her with a serious expression. "As of the market's close yesterday, your mother's estate is valued at about $1.3 trillion. The entire office felt like it was tilting. Ellie gripped the chair's arms to keep her balance. $1.3 trillion, not million, not billion. It was trillion. That is impossible, she managed to say. I can promise you the number is correct. Your mother dedicated decades to concealing her wealth. She operated through shell companies and blind trusts. She donated anonymously to hundreds of charities, but she always protected the core of her fortune, and she has left every penny of it to you. The letter slipped from Ellie's numb hand. It floated down to the floor like a single autumn leaf. Why? Ellie's voice cracked. Why did she hide all of this? Theodore's expression softened into one of compassion. Your mother was adopted as a child. As a young woman, her adoptive parents discovered her birth parents were very rich. They exploited her, they manipulated her, they attempted to seize an inheritance that was not theirs. She left home at 16 just to escape them. She built her entire fortune alone, starting with nothing, and she vowed that her own child would never be used in that way. Ellie recalled all the birthdays with handmade cakes. She remembered the Christmases with thoughtfully selected presents. She thought of all the times Rose said they could not afford something when she could have easily bought the whole world. It was all for her benefit. It was all arranged so Ellie would know for certain that she was loved for herself alone. There is something else, Theodore said softly. But perhaps we should take a break. This is a great deal to absorb. Ellie shook her head. No, I need to know everything. For the following 2 hours, Theodore laid out the entire story. He described the pharmaceutical business, the patents, and all the investments. He spoke of the charitable foundations Rose had quietly supported for many years. She'd given money to hospitals, orphanages, and shelters for women. She'd established college scholarships for kids in foster care. Rose did not simply make money. She had secretly improved thousands of lives without ever taking any credit. When Theodore was finished, Ellie sat in total silence. The afternoon light had shifted in his office, and long shadows now covered the walls. What do I do now? She asked at last. Well, we begin the steps to transfer the estate to your name. It will require some time. The will needs to be filed with the probate court. When that is done, all of this will become public information. Public information? That meant Grant was about to learn everything. How much time? She asked with urgency. How long before this is public? Theodore considered it. We can likely delay it for several weeks. It could be a month, but eventually, everyone would find out. Ellie thought of Grant, his demand for a divorce, and his smug certainty that she could not hire a good lawyer. He was convinced he held all the cards. He was so completely wrong. Delay him, Ellie requested, for as long as you possibly can. Theodore nodded in agreement. There is one other thing. Your mother left me with some very specific instructions, he repeated her words precisely. When the predators begin to circle, you must tell Eleanor that she is much stronger than she realizes. Stronger than she knows. Rose had said those exact words to her on her final good day. Back then, Ellie had thought she meant facing loss and handling grief. But Rose knew. She must have known Grant would betray her. Maybe not the exact details, but she sensed that something was terribly wrong. She had been trying to prepare her daughter. Ellie picked up the letter from the floor. She folded it neatly and put it in her purse. Thank you, Theodore. We have much more to discuss, he replied, but it can wait. You need a moment to absorb all of this. The drive home was a complete haze for Ellie. The engine of her old Honda coughed as she drove over a speed bump, and the air conditioner rattled weakly. Her car radio could only find 3 stations, $1.3 trillion, and here she was, driving a car that was older than some of her former co-workers. She pulled into the driveway of the modest colonial home. It was the home where she had been raised. It was the home where her mother, Rose, had taught her to ride her bicycle in the yard. It was the house that contained every single one of her childhood memories. She went from room to room looking at everything with a completely new perspective. The worn-in sofa, the store-brand cereal, the kitchen counter with a tiny chip. Every single thing was a choice. Rose had wanted a simple existence. She chose authenticity. She chose love over luxury. Ellie went to Rose's closet. Inside there were simple dresses and practical shoes. There was also a single, beautiful silk scarf, a deep emerald green folded perfectly on the top shelf. Rose had always said that the scarf was a gift. from someone I cared for deeply, she used to say. Now Ellie was left to wonder about its origin. What was the tale behind this one expensive item in a closet full of simple things? She realized she would probably never know. Rose had taken some of her secrets with her, but she had not taken the most important one. That secret was finally out, at least to Ellie. She sat on Rose's bed. It was the bed where Rose read her stories before she slept as a child. It was the bed where Rose held her close when thunder and lightning lit up the night sky. And it was the bed where, just 1 week ago, Rose had taken her very last breath. Both Grant and Vivian cast me aside. They treated me like I was worthless. Let them think I am defeated. Let them have their brief moment of triumph. For the first time since she had found Grant and Vivian together, Ellie felt a new feeling replacing the emptiness. It started as a tiny spark. It was not hope, but something much colder and stronger. It was complete determination. She understood she would survive this. She would do more than just survive. She would emerge from this stronger than she had ever imagined. Rose had left her with all the tools she would ever need. Now it was her job to learn how to use them. 3 days passed, and each one felt like a year. Ellie spent the time reading. Theodore sent over boxes of documents. There were financial reports, investment summaries, business records, and reports from charitable groups. It was the complete story of Rose's secret life. The more Ellie learned, the more amazed she was. Her mother did not simply collect wealth. She did it with brilliant planning, with a strong sense of ethics, and with incredible talent. She invested in companies that made life-saving medicines. Her mother had financed research for clean energy. She bought apartment buildings and deliberately set low rents for working families. Rose tried to make everything she touched better. She never did it for public praise or tax breaks. She did it because she felt it was the right thing. And she did all this while using coupons and driving a 12-year-old Honda. Ellie finally saw the truth. Rose was not cheap. She lived by her values. She believed money was a tool to help people, not to be wasted on luxury. She had tried to pass those values to her daughter. That is why there were no private schools, fancy trips, or designer clothes. There was only love, important lessons, and warm apple pie on Sunday afternoons. On the 4th day, Ellie's phone started ringing. Grant's name appeared on the screen. She almost let it go, but something made her answer. "Ellie," he said, his voice flat and careful, "we need to talk about the house." "What about it?" "It is a marital asset," he replied. "We need to decide what to do with it. It is my mother's house. She left it to me in her will. We are still married. That means it is legally community property. My lawyer told me so." "Your attorney?" Ellie cut him off. "You already have a lawyer?" "His name is Victor Crawford. He is known as one of the best divorce lawyers in the state. He will make sure we split everything fairly." Ellie knew that name. Victor Crawford was famous for his aggressive tactics. He would dig up any dirt he could find to destroy the other person. "I see," Ellie said quietly. "I am trying to be reasonable here, Ellie. I do not want this to get ugly. But if you are going to make this hard, I am not the one making it hard. I am just protecting my property." Grant laughed, but it was a cold sound. "What property, Ellie? You do not have a job. You were laid off 3 months ago, remember? You have no income, no savings, and no way to pay for a lawyer. The smart thing to do is accept my offer and move on." The smart thing, in Grant's mind, was always what helped him the most. "What offer?" Ellie asked. "I keep the house we lived in. You can have your mother's house. We get 50-50 custody of the children. I will not even ask you for alimony, even though I could, since you are unemployed." "That is so kind of you." "I'm trying to be fair." "Fair?" The word tasted like poison to Ellie. "I need some time to think," she told him. "Do not take too much time. Victor says—" Ellie ended the call. She sat in her mother's kitchen, looking at papers that showed an estate worth $1.3 trillion. Then she started to laugh. It was not a happy laugh, it was a bitter one. Grant thought she had nothing. He thought she was helpless. He thought he could bully her into surrender. He truly had no idea who he was dealing with. She made a call to Theodore. "I need the best divorce lawyer in Ohio," she said. "I need someone who can go against Victor Crawford and win." "I know exactly who to call," he said. "Diane Prescott. She is a legend. She is also very intimidating, and she has never lost a case. Please set up a meeting." That afternoon, Ellie did something she had been avoiding. She drove back to the house she had shared with Grant. She needed her clothes and some personal papers. She also had to see for herself what was left of her old life. Grant's car was in the driveway. Another car was there too. A shiny white Mercedes she recognized immediately. It belonged to Vivian. For a moment, Ellie considered turning back. But then she reminded herself that this house was still hers too. This was her home, so she had every right to go inside. She walked straight through the front door without knocking. She found Grant and Vivian in the living room. They were packing boxes and laughing together. Vivian was holding one of Ellie's sweaters. It was a light blue cashmere sweater her mother had given her for Christmas 2 years ago. "She will not be needing this anymore," Vivian said. "It is much too small for a pregnant woman." A cold, quiet feeling washed over Ellie. "Put that down," she said in a clear voice. Grant and Vivian jumped and spun around. For a second, they looked like two kids caught doing something wrong. Their faces showed a mix of fear and defiance. Then Grant's expression became hard. "Ellie, we were not expecting you." "I can see that," Ellie answered. "We are just sorting our things," he said, "trying to separate what is mine from what is yours." "That sweater is mine," Ellie said again. "Put it down." Vivian dropped the sweater like it was on fire. She then stepped back to hide behind Grant. "Ellie, please," Grant begged. "Let's be adults. We can handle this like civilized people." Civilized? He had the nerve to talk about being civilized after what he did, after what they both did. "I want you both out of this house," Ellie said, her voice completely calm. "You have 1 hour." Without any emotion, she continued, "Take only what belongs to you. Your clothes, your golf clubs, your signed baseballs. Do not touch any gifts from me or my family. Leave anything that belongs to us both. My lawyer will be in touch about the rest." Grant's face flushed with anger. "Your lawyer, Ellie? You do not have a lawyer. You are out of a job. You are out of money." He did not say the word, but it hung in the air. Broke. Ellie had lost her job 3 months earlier due to budget cuts. She had been looking for work, but then her mother got sick and needed all her time. Grant thought he knew her situation completely. He thought he was in control. A slight smile touched Ellie's lips. 1 hour, she repeated, "and do not return without a court order." She turned and left the house. She could hear Grant sputtering and Vivian whispering behind her, but she did not turn around. She drove to a nearby cafe and ordered a coffee. She just sat and watched the timer on her phone. When exactly 1 hour had passed, she drove back. Grant's car was gone. Vivian's fancy car was gone too. They had taken a few boxes, but much more was left behind. Good. Ellie packed her own suitcase. She gathered important documents from the filing cabinet. She found her grandmother's pearl necklace in the jewelry box and put it on. Then she left that house for good. That evening, alone in her mother's house, Ellie let herself remember. She pushed away the fresh pain of betrayal and lies. Instead, she thought about older memories, the ones that held a different kind of ache. She remembered meeting Vivian during their first year of college. They shared a small dorm room. Vivian was crying because she was homesick. Ellie made her hot chocolate and told her jokes to make her smile. From that day on, they were best friends. They were together through 4 years of school and 10 years of friendship. They had been bridesmaids at each other's weddings. Vivian even threw a baby shower for Ellie just last month, and during all that time, she was having an affair with Ellie's husband. Now every memory was tainted, every shared laugh and every hug felt like a complete lie. All their late-night talks about the future were just a performance. The whole time, Vivian was engaged in the ultimate deception. Ellie's mind flashed back to her wedding. Vivian had been there, adjusting her gown. She could still hear Vivian's words. "Grant is so fortunate," spoken with strangely empty eyes. Back then, Ellie dismissed it as her own insecurity. She found reasons to trust their friendship. She also recalled how Grant constantly criticized Rose. He claimed her mother was far too present in their marriage. He despised the weekly dinners and holiday gatherings. "Your mother suffocates you," he once said. "You need to learn to stand on your own." But Rose was terminally ill. She was the only family Ellie had. And Grant wanted her to abandon her dying mother, all for more time with Vivian. She remembered the last day her mother was lucid. Rose gripped Ellie's hand, her grasp surprisingly firm. Her gaze was sharp, cutting through the haze of medication. "You have more strength than you know," Rose whispered. "Remember that when the predators arrive." Ellie had thought her mother meant the sorrow of death. She assumed it was a warning about the grief of losing her mother. But Rose had seen something else entirely. Perhaps she had caught a glance between Grant and Vivian. Maybe she had heard a whispered phone call, or maybe she simply knew the sting of betrayal from her own life. For whatever reason, Rose was preparing her daughter. She was giving Ellie the weapons she would need for the fight ahead. She believed Ellie would find the courage to use them. Ellie was now curled up in Rose's favorite armchair. It was the seat where her mother had traveled through over 1,000 books. It was where she would doze off to old movies on Sunday evenings. It was where she passed her final weeks before the hospital. The chair carried the faint scent of lavender and vanilla. Now every happy memory felt poisoned with doubt. The birthday celebrations at the kitchen table, the grocery trips where Rose would analyze prices for 20 minutes, the coupon-cutting sessions that felt so tedious in her youth. Those moments were real, but they were not the complete picture. It was like staring at the placid surface of a pond with no idea an entire ocean lay just beneath. Who was this woman she had called mother? She was more than a receptionist working 2 jobs to make ends meet. She was more than a frugal planner who tracked every penny. She was a gifted chemist who founded a whole corporation. She was an anonymous philanthropist who had supported thousands. She was a brilliant investor who spun a tiny sum into a massive fortune. Rose was all of these things. But she kept that world hidden, so Ellie could have a normal childhood. The immensity of that sacrifice left Ellie breathless. She glanced at her phone and saw Grant's text. "I'm having my things collected tomorrow. Do not cause a scene." She began to compose a reply, then erased it. She tried a second time and deleted that as well. Finally, she set the phone aside. She would not answer him, let him wonder, let him stress, let him think she was defeated and fragile. Because when predators are circling, the survivor is often the one they dismissed as prey. 2 weeks passed. Ellie used the time to study documents and consult with lawyers. She was gradually uncovering the secret empire her mother had built. Diane Prescott's office was on the highest floor of a city skyscraper. The reception area was sleek and intimidating. A receptionist brought Ellie sparkling water in a crystal glass. Diane was a compact woman in her mid-50s with silver hair and the piercing eyes of a hawk. Her handshake was unexpectedly powerful. "Theodore briefed me on your situation," Diane stated. "He shared everything, including the sensitive parts. And I must admit, Mrs. Whitmore, this is poised to be the most compelling divorce I have handled in 30 years. They sat in her spacious office overlooking the city. Her desk was a picture of perfect order. "Walk me through it all," Diane said. "Start from the beginning." For the next 2 hours, Ellie recounted her story. She spoke of Grant and Vivian. She detailed the funeral, the stunning discovery, and the gut-wrenching betrayal. She laid out her mother Rose's hidden wealth and the letter that had upended her reality. Diane listened without interruption, scribbling notes on a legal pad. When Ellie finished, Diane set down her pen. "Your husband has already made several critical errors," she declared. "His choice of Victor Crawford is one. Victor has a reputation for being a bulldog, but he is also sloppy. He wins by intimidation, not through careful preparation. He counts on his opposition simply caving." Grant claimed Victor was among the best attorneys in the state, Ellie said. "Victor is among the most expensive attorneys in the state," Diane corrected with a faint smile. "There is a significant difference. I have defeated him in court 4 times. He beat me only once, and that was due to my client being dishonest with me. I assume you will not be dishonest." "I will not," Ellie promised. "I am aware," Diane said. Theodore was very clear on that point. "Now here's how this will unfold. Grant believes you are destitute and weak. He will try to bully you into a fast, cheap settlement. He will submit motions painting you as a neglectful wife and partner. He will stop at nothing to cast himself as the wronged party." "That is completely absurd," Ellie said. "Of course it is," Diane concurred. "But it is also entirely predictable, and a predictable opponent is an opponent who is simple to outmaneuver. Diane pushed a folder across her desk. This is what Victor submitted yesterday. He is arguing that your mother's home is marital property, since you did not own it prior to the wedding. He is also demanding you cover Grant's legal costs because you were voluntarily unemployed. My mother was on her deathbed, Ellie stated. I quit my job to be her caretaker. I know, Diane responded, and we will present that as evidence, but this is where things get truly revealing. Diane slid a second folder toward her. This is a sworn statement from Vivian Caldwell, and it corroborates Grant's narrative. Ellie felt a cold dread spread through her chest. What does it allege? Vivian asserts you were emotionally volatile throughout the marriage, Diane summarized. She claims you constantly accused Grant of infidelity without cause. She describes you as paranoid and possessive. She also states you neglected your husband because you were obsessed with your mother's opinions. Not a word of that is true, Ellie said, her voice shaking. I am aware, Diane replied. But Vivian has been your friend for 15 years. She is familiar with your insecurities. She knows what you fear, and now she is twisting all of it to use against you. Ellie read through Vivian's statement. It was 12 pages long, 12 pages of outright lies, distorted truths, and memories reshaped into something ugly. Vivian had transformed their friendship into a weapon. Every vulnerability Ellie had ever confessed was now being used as evidence of her instability. This is a character assassination? Ellie whispered. Yes, it is, Diane confirmed, her hawk-like eyes gleaming, and that makes it legally actionable. We can investigate every date, every text, and every instance she claims you were being irrational, Diane went on. And when we expose her dishonesty in court, she will face serious consequences. Lying under oath is a major offense. Diane leaned back, a strategist mapping out her campaign. So this is my approach. We will allow Grant and Victor to believe they have the upper hand. We will keep your mother's estate a secret until the final possible moment. We will gather proof of every falsehood and manipulation. Then we will unleash everything at once. It will be a legal ambush, an avalanche. They will be completely buried by it. Diane rose to her feet. In the meantime, your behavior must not change. Continue to live in your mother's house. Make no large purchases, and have no contact with Grant or Vivian. All communication must pass through me. Ellie nodded, the fog in her mind finally clearing. This was a war fought on multiple fronts, and for the first time since discovering the affair, she felt she was on the winning side. That evening, her phone buzzed. It was Grant's mother, Lorraine. Ellie considered ignoring it, but knew Lorraine would only persist. It was best to face it now. Eleanor, my dear, Lorraine began. Lorraine's voice was smooth, but there was a sharp edge to it. I am so glad I could get a hold of you. I know this must be an incredibly difficult time for you. What do you want, Lorraine? I just felt we should talk, as one mother to another. Or rather, a mother to a future mother, she said, laughing lightly. I understand Grant has behaved badly. Men can be quite weak creatures sometimes, but we must not let our emotions cloud our good sense. Ellie did not say a word. Grant deserves to find happiness, Lorraine continued. And honestly, my dear, you two were never really suited for each other. You have different backgrounds and different goals in life. This might be what is best for everyone. That includes the baby. That includes the baby. A child needs a stable home, Eleanor. Your behavior lately has been a little concerning. The rash decisions, your refusal to communicate. I am worried about the kind of home you can provide. And there it was. The threat was hidden inside the sweet words. Lorraine was already building her case for a custody battle. Thank you for your concern, Ellie said. I will be sure to consider it. I truly hope that you will, dear. I really do. Grant is willing to offer a generous settlement, but if you insist on dragging this through the courts... She let out a dramatic sigh. Well, the courts are so unpredictable, and attorneys have a way of digging up such messy things. Ellie allowed the call to end without another word. She sat still as the evening shadows crept across her mother's living room. The list of people against her was getting longer. Grant, Victor, Vivian, and now Lorraine. They were all circling, thinking she was weak. They had no idea what she was planning to do. The next morning, Theodore called her. He told her there was something she had to know about Grant's law firm. When Ellie asked what it was, he told her they had been searching for her mother's assets for many years. The firm worked for clients who had lost patent lawsuits against Rose's old pharmaceutical company. They were convinced the Bellingham fortune was far larger than it appeared. A cold feeling washed over Ellie. She asked if the firm, not Grant personally, had been looking into her mother. Theodore said yes, it was the firm. He warned that as soon as the will was filed, it would all become public. They would find out that their own lawyer had married the heir to the very fortune they had been hunting for a decade. Ellie knew it could not just be a coincidence. Theodore agreed it was very unlikely. Her thoughts were racing. Did Grant know about Rose's money all along? Was their entire relationship a plan to get access to a secret fortune? Was it possible their whole life together was based on a gamble that never paid off? Ellie told Theodore she needed a moment to absorb it all. He was understanding but said they could not delay filing the will much longer. He figured they had maybe 3 more weeks until it was all out in the open. 3 weeks. That was the only time she had to prepare. 3 weeks to build her defense. 3 weeks until the world learned the truth about Rose Bellingham and the woman her daughter was becoming. The days grew shorter as September turned into October. In her mother's yard, the leaves of the big maple tree shifted to bright gold and red, then drifted down like forgotten memories. Ellie was now 8 months pregnant. The baby inside her was always moving, and its kicks felt strong and full of purpose, like it was ready to enter a world that knew nothing about its coming arrival. Theodore started sending her documents. There were thousands of pages covering Rose's business deals, investment strategies, patent filings, and corporate structures so complex they made Ellie's head hurt, but she read every word, every note, and every single page. If she was going to run an empire, she needed to know how it was made. In the midst of all this, Diane would call her with updates. Grant's lawyers filed 3 new motions, each one more aggressive than the last. They were after the house, they were after the car, and they demanded Ellie undergo a psychological evaluation. Diane said their plan was to build a record of instability. If they could convince a judge she was not mentally fit, they would have a much better chance at getting full custody of the baby. It was all built on the lies Vivian was telling, lies they were presenting as facts from Ellie's supposed best friend. This was the very reason they needed people to tell a different version of the story. Ellie admitted that most of her friends were also friends of Grant or Vivian. There has to be someone, Diane pushed, a co-worker or a neighbor who could speak to her character. Ellie thought hard about it. So much of her life had been seen through the lens of Grant and Vivian. Their poisonous friendship had consumed so much of her world that she had allowed other connections to wither. But then, she thought of someone. Charlotte Henderson. They worked together at the nonprofit agency before Ellie was let go. Everyone knew her as Charlie, and she had a reputation for being brutally honest. Ellie told Diane she might have a person, and she called Charlie later that afternoon. Charlie's voice was warm, and she sounded a little surprised to hear from Ellie. She said she had been thinking about calling, that she had heard about Ellie's mother, and was terribly sorry. Ellie thanked her, and then Charlie brought up Grant and Vivian. Her voice immediately turned to ice. She called Vivian a poisonous snake wearing expensive shoes and said she had always been one. When Ellie asked her why she never said so, Charlie asked if she would have believed her. After a brief pause, Ellie admitted that she probably would not have. Charlie said that was the thing about snakes. They are masters at looking like gorgeous silk scarves right before they choke the life from you. With a sigh, Charlie asked what she could do for her, guessing it was not just a social call. Ellie explained her situation. She did not mention the inheritance, but gave Charlie enough information to know how bad it was. Charlie listened, then repeated the key points to be sure she had it right. Grant cheated on her with her best friend at her mother's funeral when she was 7 months pregnant, and now he was trying to paint her as the unstable one. When Ellie confirmed that was the general idea, Charlie's answer was quick and angry. She said she would absolutely testify for her. She would say it in court, on the news, or even hire a plane to write it in the sky. She had worked with Ellie every day for 3 years, and she was the most dependable, skilled person there. She called Ellie the most solid person in that whole workplace and said anyone who said differently was a flat-out liar. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Ellie felt tears coming to her eyes. But these were not tears of sadness. They were tears of overwhelming gratitude. She thanked Charlie, who just told her not to say thank you, but to go win. A couple of days later, Charlie came over to the house. She arrived with bags full of groceries, baby supplies, and her special kind of direct honesty that could slice through any garbage. They sat in Rose's kitchen, drinking coffee without caffeine, while Charlie looked around the modest home. She commented that this was where Ellie was raised and that it was a nice, warm place. Charlie observed that her mother liked to keep things very simple. Ellie almost laughed at how much of an understatement that was. She just replied that her mother believed in living simply and was practical in that way. Charlie said she would have liked to have met her and that she sounded like a wonderful woman. Ellie just said that she was. Charlie said that woman was supposed to be like your own sister, but she stabbed you right in the back with a smile. Ellie said quietly that they were together for 14 months before she found out. Charlie was shocked. 14 months of secrets. 14 months of lies. Every time Vivian gave her a hug, asked about her life, or gave her advice, it was all just an act. Charlie shook her head, saying that it takes a special kind of evil person to do something like that. Ellie had thought the very same thing many times in the middle of the night when she could not sleep and the awful memories just kept replaying. She admitted that she had trusted Vivian more than almost anyone on earth, and that is what made the betrayal cut so very deep. Charlie put her hand on top of Ellie's and squeezed it gently. She told her that she was going to make it through all of this. She promised her that she would come out of this stronger than she had ever been, and that Grant and Vivian would live to regret every single thing they did to her. Ellie wanted to believe her so much. She needed to believe there was some kind of light at the end of this dark path. But right then, all she could see was darkness. Later that evening, she received the latest legal papers from Grant's attorneys. This was far worse than anything she had imagined. Victor Crawford's private investigator had invaded every part of Ellie's life. He found her college grades, her entire job history, and even her medical records. They were from a brief time she saw a therapist at 22 after a family friend died. Now they were using her counseling for grief to claim she was mentally unstable. They also accused her of having a history of unpredictable actions. They used one event from 6 years ago when she called the police, believing someone was breaking into her apartment. The police arrived but found nothing. Now Grant's lawyers called it a hallucination. Ellie remembered that night clearly. She heard strange noises while Grant was away on a work trip. She was scared and all alone, so she did what anyone would have done. But they had twisted it into proof that she was crazy. And it did not stop there. Vivian submitted even more statements, full of new lies and warped memories, all of them like poison. Ellie sat in her mother's armchair and read every single word. The assault on her character was cold and calculated. It was designed to paint her as a mother who was unfit to raise her own child. They were trying to take her baby. That one thought cut through her sadness and feeling of betrayal, giving her a sharp, cold focus. They could try to take her house and her money. They could destroy her reputation and drag her name through the mud. But she would never let them take her child. She picked up the phone and called Diane. She explained that she had just read the new court papers. Diane said she was about to call her, adding that while it seemed bad, it was also a sign of their desperation. Victor was simply trying anything he could, hoping something would stick. Ellie mentioned how they were using her grief counseling against her. Diane confirmed that information was private, and they had obtained it illegally so they could ask the judge to ignore it. Diane's voice was calm and filled with confidence. She explained that they had made a huge mistake by being too aggressive. They were not thinking clearly because they assumed Ellie had no way to fight them. Exactly, Diane said. And when we reveal what you really have, their entire case is going to fall apart. After a short pause, Diane said she had a serious question for Ellie and needed a completely honest answer. When Ellie agreed, Diane asked if there was anything in her past that they could use against her. She explained that she had to know now so they could be prepared. Ellie thought about it for a long time. She searched her mind for every mistake she had made, every embarrassing moment, and every secret she ever had. In the end, she said no. She told Diane that her life had been very ordinary, and the wildest thing she had ever done was marry Grant, and they both knew how that turned out. For the first time, Ellie heard a real laugh from Diane. "Good," Diane said. "Then we move ahead with our plan. Let them build their case on lies and evidence they should not have. When the truth is finally revealed, they will not know what hit them." After the call ended, Ellie sat alone as the house grew dark. She was 8 months pregnant, and everyone she trusted had either left her or turned on her. It felt as if the entire world was against her. She spoke softly to her unborn baby. "I do not know how to do this," she whispered. "I do not know how I can fight all of them. Your grandmother would have known what to do. She always did." As if in reply, the baby gave a strong kick. And then, despite it all, Ellie started to cry. It was a deep cry that shook her to her core, seeming to empty her of everything inside. She cried for Rose, the mother she missed terribly, and for the secrets her mother took with her. She cried for her marriage and the love she thought was real. She cried for the future she had dreamed they would have together. She cried for Vivian, for a friendship that was all a lie, and for the sister she never truly had. She cried for herself, for the person she was before, and for an innocence she could never get back. When she finally stopped crying, she felt completely drained, like a hollowed-out version of herself, sitting alone in the dark house. But an empty space can be filled with something new. That emptiness could leave room for something much stronger. At 3 o'clock in the morning, in the deepest part of the night, Ellie went to the kitchen. She pulled out the ingredients she knew by heart: flour, sugar, butter, and apples. She started to make her mother's apple pie. It was the same pie Rose had taught her to make when she was only 8 years old. It was the same recipe Rose made every Sunday for as long as Ellie could remember. She cored the apples, rolled the dough, and shaped the edge of the crust just as Rose had showed her countless times. The warm smell of cinnamon, sugar, and baked apples soon filled the room. It was the scent of home. It was the scent of love. It was the scent of everything Rose had given her. For a little while there in the quiet of her kitchen, everything felt right again. Ellie could feel Rose's presence right there beside her. She could almost hear her mother's voice whispering, "You are so much stronger than you know." The oven timer went off, letting her know the pie was done. Ellie carefully removed it and set it on the counter to cool. She did not eat any of it. She did not have to. The simple act of baking it had been enough. The next morning came, and Ellie woke with tired eyes but a very clear mind. She had come to a decision. She picked up her phone and called Theodore. "I need to learn everything," she told him. "The companies, the investments, and all the foundations. I want to understand everything my mother built. Teach me how it all works." Theodore was silent for a moment. "That is an enormous task," he finally said. "We are talking about one of the most complex financial empires in the entire country." "Then I suppose we should begin," Ellie replied. For the next 2 weeks, Ellie became a dedicated student again. Theodore hired a team of experts to assist her. Tutors, financial analysts, and business consultants came to teach her. Each one signed a strict confidentiality agreement promising to keep their students' identity a secret. She learned about shell corporations and complicated ownership structures. She studied patent collections and licensing agreements. She began to understand the careful balance of public and private investments that her mother had expertly handled for many years. The enormous scale of it all was stunning. Rose had owned large shares in drug companies that made medicine used by millions of people. She had invested in technology startups long before they were famous. She had bought land in cities that later experienced huge growth in value. It seemed as if she had a special gift for success, but it was not about luck. It was the product of deep research, incredible patience, and a brilliant mind that worked with amazing discipline for decades. And now, all of it belonged to Ellie. "Your mother left behind very specific instructions for her charities," Theodore told her one afternoon. "She wanted them to keep operating exactly as they always had. All donations were to stay anonymous, with no announcements to the press and no public recognition." He continued, "She really did not want anyone to know. She strongly believed that true generosity must be anonymous. She thought that charity for public attention is not charity at all." Theodore gave a warm smile. She was a very special woman, Ellie answered. I am starting to understand just how special she was. Inside a folder for the largest of the charitable foundations, Ellie discovered a handwritten note from Rose. This foundation was the one that gave scholarships to children in foster care. The note said, I built all of this my entire life, but it was always for you. My purpose was not to make you rich, but to make you free. Free. That was the one thing Rose had wanted for her daughter. It was not about having money just to have money. It was about the kind of freedom that money can give you, the freedom to choose your own path in life, the freedom to walk away from anyone who treated you badly, the freedom to never need a man like Grant. Ellie must have read that simple note 100 times. Each time she read it, the meaning became a little clearer. Her friend Charlie started visiting every couple of days, becoming Ellie's personal emotional support person. I just saw Vivian's Instagram, Charlie said one afternoon. She and Grant were at some ridiculously expensive restaurant. They posted all these pictures of themselves looking so in love and perfectly happy. I do not want to see it, Ellie said. You are right. You do not need to, Charlie replied. I just wanted to tell you the comments section is ruthless. Nobody is believing their little show for 1 second. The news is out. You know how this town talks? Half the city knows he cheated on his pregnant wife with her best friend just after her mother died. Charlie smiled. He certainly isn't winning any friends with this behavior, I can tell you that. It was a minor consolation, but at that moment, Ellie would take any she could get. So how are you really doing? Charlie asked. And I want the truth, not the brave face you show everyone else. Ellie considered the question for a moment. I am worn out, she confessed. I am terrified and I am furious. But underneath it all, I am also more determined than I have ever been. Is that strange? It makes total sense, Charlie said, nodding. You are discovering your strength. A lot of people live their whole lives without doing that. They let the world knock them down and they just stay there. But not you. You are fighting your way back up. I do not feel like I have a choice, Ellie said. There is a baby to consider now. You always have a choice, Charlie corrected gently. You could have crumbled. You could have accepted whatever Grant offered and just vanished. But you refused. Charlie's expression turned serious. That is a sign of true character, Ellie. The kind of strength that comes from deep within. Ellie rested a hand on her belly. The baby was kicking and tumbling inside her. I am going to name her Rose, Ellie said softly. A wide smile spread across Charlie's face. For your mom. She was the toughest person I ever knew. I want my daughter to carry a piece of that resilience with her. Rose Whitmore, Charlie said, trying the name out. I love it. That sounds like someone who does not put up with any nonsense. That is the whole idea, Ellie confirmed. A couple of days later, a surprising thing happened. Ellie received a letter in the mail. It was not a digital message, but an actual letter written by hand on very fine paper. The return address had a name she did not know. Bennett Holloway. The note inside was brief. It read, Dear Mrs. Whitmore, we have never met, but I was a close associate of your mother. There are certain things about our business that you should be aware of. This information could affect your current situation. I would be very glad to speak with you if you are willing. I am sure that I can help you. Sincerely, Bennett Holloway. Ellie rushed to show the letter to Theodore. Bennett Holloway. Theodore said his name slowly. I remember that name. He was your mother's business partner from the very beginning. They parted ways about 20 years ago. Why did they end their partnership? Ellie questioned. Your mother never told me the specifics, Theodore confessed. She only mentioned that Bennett made a huge mistake and she could not work with him after that. Do you think I should meet him? Ellie asked. Theodore considered it. Your mother did trust him once, he pointed out, and if he really knows something that can help you, it might be wise to hear his story. Ellie chose to meet him. She replied with a letter suggesting a coffee shop downtown. It was a public place and felt like safe, neutral ground. Bennett Holloway appeared to be in his early 40s. His hair had some gray streaks, and his eyes looked weary. He wore nice clothes that were not too flashy. He got a plain black coffee and waited for Ellie to sit down before he spoke. I appreciate you coming to meet me, he started. To be honest, I was not certain you would. I am very curious about what you have to say, Ellie answered. Bennett nodded his head slightly. That makes sense. I will be direct. He stopped for a moment and took a large breath. Your mother rescued me, and after she saved my life, I betrayed her. Ellie stayed quiet, letting him go on. 20 years ago, I had a big problem with drinking and gambling, he admitted. I was close to losing everything I had. Your mother found out what was going on, but she did not just walk away. She paid every one of my debts. She checked me into a treatment facility. She gave me a fresh start. That really sounds like something she would do, Ellie said in a soft voice. It was pure kindness, Bennett said, as his eyes began to fill with tears. And how did I repay her? I nearly sold secrets about her to a reporter to cover new gambling losses after I relapsed. She discovered it right before it happened and stopped me. What did she do? Ellie asked him. He looked straight at her and said, She paid the debts. A second time. He convinced the reporter to drop the story, and then he cut me off completely. Bennett's voice trembled. For the last 20 years, I have tried to be worthy of the chance she gave me. I never got to apologize. She was gone before I could tell her how sorry I was for my actions. His confession landed heavily on Ellie. It felt true to everything she knew about Rose. Her mother gave quietly and forgave those who hurt her. She was a blend of profound strength and gentle compassion. So why are you telling me this now? Because I have something that will help you. It is about your mother's company. It is about the people who have been chasing her fortune for years. Ellie leaned in, suddenly focused. Which people? Grant's firm? Crawford and Associates? They have used private investigators for over 10 years trying to locate that money. Their clients are people who lost patent cases against your mother's old business. Theodore told me something about that. Did Theodore also tell you Grant was involved with the Bellingham file 3 years before he met you? The warmth in the little coffee shop vanished completely. No, Ellie said, her voice faint. He never mentioned that. Grant was not the main lawyer on your mother's case, but he worked on related matters. He knew there was a hidden fortune connected to the Bellingham name. Bennett leaned forward. I have no solid proof he targeted you, but the timeline seems very convenient. Ellie's mind spun. She remembered meeting Grant at a fundraiser. He had approached her first. He was so charismatic, so attentive, and acted like she was the most interesting person alive. He was fascinated by her family, especially her mother. Why are you helping me now? Ellie asked. Because I have a debt to your mother that can never be repaid. This is the only way I can think of to even start. Bennett held her gaze. I have documents and records your mother gave me before I turned on her. If you want them, they are yours. What kind of records? Evidence of how your mother's competitors tried to destroy her company. Names, dates, and who they were connected to. He paused. That includes the links that go straight to Crawford and Associates. Ellie understood immediately. Bennett was handing her ammunition. Send it all to my attorney. Her name is Diane Prescott, Ellie stated. I know Diane. Your mother recommended her to me a long time ago. A faint smile touched Bennett's lips. Rose was always good at finding talented people. They parted ways at the cafe entrance. Bennett looked like he wanted to say more, but he just nodded and walked away. Ellie stood on the sidewalk for a long time. The fall air was crisp, and leaves swirled at her feet. Rose had forgiven Bennett for his betrayal. She gave him a second chance, but she also stopped speaking to him. Forgiveness and forgetting are two different things. Rose knew that. She protected herself while still being compassionate. She refused to let someone else's mistakes define her own character. That was a lesson Ellie had to learn for herself. She could not forgive Grant, at least not yet. Perhaps she never could. But she would not let his actions change who she was. That was her choice. That was her power. And no one could take it from her. The pain started at 3 a.m, a full 3 weeks early. Ellie had been dreaming about her mother. They were in the family kitchen, baking pies together. Rose was showing her how to crimp the pie crust when a sudden agony ripped through her. Ellie gasped, waking up and fighting for breath. Another wave of pain hit her, strong and undeniable. This was not right. It was happening too soon. Her hands shook as she grabbed her phone and called Charlie. "I think I am in labor," she gasped when Charlie answered. "It is too early, but the baby is coming." "I am coming now. Do not move." Charlie arrived in just 15 minutes. She helped Ellie to the car and raced toward the hospital. Ellie gripped the door, breathing hard through each mounting contraction. The emergency room was blindingly bright and freezing, smelling strongly of antiseptic. Nurses immediately swarmed around her. They got her into a wheelchair and began firing questions she struggled to answer. "What is your emergency contact's name?" a nurse asked. "Charlie Henderson," Ellie answered. "She is the one who brought me. She is right here." It was not Grant. It was not Vivian. It was none of the people from her former life. It was only Charlie, who was there when she needed someone most. They wheeled her to a delivery room. Dr. Foley entered, her expression calm and professional despite the early hour. "Your baby is early, but we are not in the danger zone," Dr. Foley reassured her. "At 37 weeks, she should be perfectly fine." "She?" Ellie asked. The doctor smiled. "Yes, your daughter. She seems eager to make her appearance." The labor was long and brutal. It was 12 hours of pain, fear, and sheer exhaustion. Charlie was there the entire time. She squeezed Ellie's hand, wiped her face with a cool cloth, and spoke softly to her. Ellie did not understand what she said, but the comfort in her voice was enough. Then, at 3:15 in the afternoon, the situation became critical. "The cord is around the neck," Dr. Foley announced, her voice suddenly sharp. "We have to move now." The room exploded with activity. Staff rushed in, alarms blared from the monitors, and people shouted orders that made no sense to Ellie. Then, a terrifying quiet fell over the room. For 6 minutes, which felt like an eternity, there was no baby's cry. Ellie was helpless, unable to see or do anything but pray. And then she heard it. A tiny, furious wail, the most beautiful sound in the world. "We have her," Dr. Foley said. "Here is your daughter." They laid the baby on Ellie's chest. She was so small, so pink, and more perfect than she could have imagined. Rose Margaret Whitmore drew her first breath, and Ellie's life changed forever. A few hours later, Ellie was resting. Her new daughter was sleeping on her chest. Charlie had gone to get them something to eat. The hospital room was quiet and serene. That was the moment Grant chose to walk in. He carried a large bouquet. Yellow roses, Ellie thought with a bitter smile. He never knew her mother despised yellow roses. "Ellie," he started, his expression full of fake concern. "My mother told me about the baby. I came as soon as I heard." "How kind of you." Grant moved toward the bed. He looked at the baby, and his expression flickered for a moment. Was it wonder? Or was it a cold assessment? "She is beautiful," he said. "She looks just like you." "She looks like herself," Ellie replied. Grant sat down in the visitor's chair, still holding the bouquet. He finally seemed to remember the flowers and set them awkwardly on the table. "I have been thinking a lot," he told her, "about us, about what went wrong." "Is that so?" "I messed up, Ellie. I made a terrible mistake." "The thing with Vivian? It was nothing." He waved a hand dismissively. "It did not mean anything. I was not thinking straight. Your mother was dying, you were distracted, and I felt ignored. I know that is no excuse." Ellie listened in silence. She said nothing at all. She had discovered the power of silence recently. Sometimes saying nothing is the strongest thing you can do. "I want to be a father to this baby," Grant continued. "I want us to be a family again. We can move forward from this. Other couples survive affairs. It does not have to be over." The baby stirred, and Ellie adjusted her hold, still not speaking. A flicker of irritation crossed Grant's face. "I am trying to make this right, Ellie. Could you at least say something?" That is when Ellie finally looked at him. Her voice was quiet, but solid as rock. "You want to make things right?" "Yes." "You want to be a family?" "Yes." "You left me alone at my mother's funeral when I was carrying your child. You let your lover humiliate me in the home we shared. You sicked a lawyer on me to say I was unstable. You were trying to strip me of my house, my car, and my own baby." Grant's face grew cold. "That is all legal strategy. That has nothing to do with us personally. We do not have a personal life, Grant. We have not had one in a long time. Maybe we never did. You cannot mean that? I do, Ellie said, her eyes locked on his. You can have supervised visits. My lawyer will send you the paperwork. Ellie, come on. Her name is Rose, and it is time for you to go. Grant simply looked at her. Ellie braced herself for an outburst or a scene that would require security to remove him. But Grant was a man who calculated every action. He knew a losing game when he saw one. He had come to the hospital expecting a weak, fragile new mother he could manipulate. He instead met a woman he did not recognize at all. Fine, he said. He turned and left without another word. The yellow roses sat on the table where he left them. Ellie later found a nurse and asked her to throw them away. Charlie returned with some food and a look of total understanding. Was that Grant I saw in the hallway? It was, Ellie confirmed. What did he want? He wanted to pretend we were a happy family, Ellie said, gazing at her sleeping infant. I refused. Charlie sat beside her and handed her a sandwich. Good for you. They ate quietly together. The baby continued to sleep while the hospital monitors beeped a calm, steady beat. Through the window, the setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange, pink, and gold. Ellie said in a low voice, almost to herself, I do not need him. I never did. I just thought I did. Charlie simply nodded and said nothing. Some realizations are too powerful to interrupt. That evening, she was alone with her little girl. Ellie whispered to her new daughter, Your grandmother would have adored you. She would have spoiled you, taught you her baking secrets, and told you that family is made by choice, not by blood. The baby's tiny fingers wrapped around Ellie's finger, so small and perfect. I choose you, Ellie said with a gentle voice. I will choose you every day for the rest of my life. 6 weeks after the birth, it was time to file the will. Ellie was in Theodore's office with baby Rose sleeping in her carrier. The legal papers were spread across the shiny desk. This was the point of no return. After this becomes public record, your life will change forever, Theodore cautioned. The news will find out, Grant will find out, the whole world will learn who Rose Bellingham really was. I know, Ellie said. Are you ready for all of that? Ellie thought about the last few months. She recalled the sharp pain of betrayal, the heavy sadness, and the constant worry. Then she thought about how she had slowly transformed from a helpless victim to a much stronger person. I am ready. Theodore filed the official will that afternoon. The story broke just 2 days later. It began quietly, with one post from a financial blogger. Then a local newspaper reporter saw it. Soon after, a major national news organization ran the story. By the end of the week, Rose Bellingham was a massive news story. The secret billionaire philanthropist revealed. Grandmother from Ohio was the genius behind medical miracles. America's hidden fortune. How one woman concealed $1 trillion. The articles praised Rose for her brilliant mind, her quiet charity, and her decision to live a normal life despite having more wealth than many countries. The stories also talked about Ellie. They shared the tale of the daughter, the sole heir, and the pregnant wife left by her husband for her best friend. That part of the story spread very quickly. Cheating husband learns abandoned wife is heir to $1 trillion estate. Best friend's betrayal ends in a surprising twist. The woman they left behind is now the wealthiest person in Ohio. From a funeral affair to an incredible fortune, the divorce that will cost him billions. Ellie's phone started ringing all the time. Reporters, television hosts, and movie producers all wanted to tell her story. She did not answer any of them. Grant called her 17 times in one day. She never picked up. Vivian also tried to call, but only once. She left a message that Ellie deleted without listening. Diane called. But her news was actually helpful. Victor Crawford is not Grant's lawyer anymore, she explained. His law firm suddenly discovered a conflict of interest. They are on the other side of several lawsuits that involve your mother's companies. The companies I am in charge of now? Ellie clarified. Exactly, Diane said, and her voice sounded very pleased. Grant is frantically looking for a new attorney, but no one with a good reputation will take his case. The bad press is just too damaging. "So what happens with the divorce?" Ellie asked. "It means we have all the power now. Grant's whole case depended on you being poor and alone. Now everyone knows that is not true." For the first time in what felt like forever, a genuine smile appeared on Ellie's face. The information Bennett found was incredibly damaging to Grant. His firm had been investigating Rose for years, and Grant had worked on cases connected to it. The evidence strongly suggested his entire relationship with Ellie could have been a planned deception. "I cannot prove he married you as part of a scheme," Diane said, "but I can prove his firm had a reason to find your mother's wealth, and I can prove he hid that fact from you during your marriage." "Will that be enough?" Ellie asked. "Yes, when combined with everything else we have. Grant is now in danger of losing his license to practice law for his actions. His divorce case is a mess, and Vivian is being investigated for lying under oath." Ellie thought about Vivian, the woman she once considered her closest friend, the woman who was her maid of honor, only to betray her so deeply. But now Ellie felt nothing at all. There was no rage, no desire for payback, just an empty space where her friendship once lived. That realization felt like a kind of healing. In the following weeks, events moved forward rapidly. Grant's new lawyer was skilled but had no chance. The settlement discussions were very brief. Ellie got everything she had requested. She was granted full custody of Rose and the house, which she sold right away. Neither of them would receive any alimony. It was a complete and total separation from the man she once thought she loved. Grant was left with his fancy clubs, his baseball cards, and a ruined name that would follow him for the rest of his days. Vivian had to deal with a different outcome. The investigation into her false statements did not result in a criminal trial. But for Vivian, her professional life was over. In the exclusive world of interior design, nobody would touch a decorator who lied on the stand against her best friend. The last Ellie heard, Vivian had left town to build a new life somewhere else. Grant was not part of that new life. It made sense they turned on each other. People who use others together almost always end up using one another. Ellie scanned the articles about them, feeling nothing. These two people had nearly destroyed her. They tried to take her baby away. They made her question her own sanity. But now, they were just names on a page. They were characters in a story that was no longer hers. She finally understood something her mother Rose used to say. The opposite of love is not hate, it is feeling nothing at all. When you have truly moved on, the people who hurt you become strangers. Grant and Vivian were strangers now. And strangers held no power over her. A year later, Ellie stood in front of a building that was not there 12 months ago. It was 3 stories of glass, brick, and new beginnings. A sign over the door read, "The Rosemary Bellingham Center for Women in Crisis." It was the dream Ellie had brought to life. The center was a safe place for women escaping bad situations. It offered job training to help them stand on their own 2 feet. It had a legal clinic for women fighting for their kids or their freedom. There was even a daycare so mothers could work and not have to worry. And everything was free, paid for by the fortune Rose had secretly saved her entire life. Today was the grand opening. Hundreds of people were there. Reporters, city officials, and community leaders filled the space. In the front row, Charlie Henderson held a 1-year-old Rose as Ellie walked to the podium. The microphone felt strange in her hand. A year ago, she could barely speak. Now she was about to address a crowd. "My mother was let down by the very people who should have loved her," Ellie began. She left home at 16 with nothing but the clothes on her back. But from that, she built an empire. She did not do it for herself. She did it for anyone who ever felt alone, who was cast aside, who was told they were not good enough. She paused. The room was completely still, hanging on her every word. "She taught me that you choose your family. She taught me that you choose to be strong. And she taught me that you can choose to wake up every day and not let anyone else's darkness define who you are." Ellie looked at her daughter in Charlie's arms. Rose was reaching for her, making happy baby sounds. "This center exists because my mother believed everyone deserves another chance, a clean slate, and a safe harbor when their world falls to pieces." She thought of the women who would soon come through these doors, women who were once like her mother, women who were once like her, women who felt they had lost everything. If you are out there tonight and you are wondering if things can get better, I am telling you they can. It is not easy and it is not fast, but it does get better. You just have to put one foot in front of the other, one day at a time, one choice at a time. Until one day you realize the person who cast you aside was really the one who set you free. A wave of applause erupted. Ellie smiled. It was not the tight, painful smile from her mother's funeral. It was a real smile, from someone who had walked through fire and come out whole on the other side. After the ceremony, Ellie carried Rose through the new building. Charlie had gone to manage some final details. The hallways were quiet now, waiting for the first women to arrive the next morning. She stopped at the dedication plaque near the front door. In loving memory of Rosemary Bellingham, who believed true charity was anonymous, but whose daughter wanted the world to know her name? It felt right. Rose had lived her life in the shadows, but her legacy was something to be celebrated. Charlie found her standing there. "That was a great speech," Charlie said. "It was completely terrifying. You did not look scared. You looked like a woman who knows exactly who she is." Charlie smiled. "Rose would have been so proud. I really hope so." They walked outside into the cool autumn night. Leaves swirled around their feet. Just 1 year ago, Ellie was at her mother's grave, pregnant, alone, and so afraid. Now she was a different person entirely. "Have you heard from Grant lately?" Charlie asked. "His bankruptcy was finalized last month. I cannot think of anyone who deserves it more," Ellie said with a small laugh. "Vivian left him about 6 months ago. Rumor is, she found someone richer." "I am shocked," Charlie said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Two terrible people who were made for each other turned out to be terrible to each other. Who could have possibly guessed?" "I honestly do not think about them anymore," Ellie admitted. "Good," Charlie said. "They are not worth your time." And he was right. For months, she had been drowning in anger, hurt, and the need for payback. But somewhere along the way, those feelings just disappeared. She had not forgiven them, and she had not forgotten. But she had let them go. It was like finding out the prison door had been unlocked the whole time. Grant and Vivian were not the ones holding her. The real prison was her own belief that she needed their approval. The moment she stopped needing it, she was free. The evening sky settled over the city. Ellie drove home on roads she knew by heart. She passed the cafe where she had first met Bennett. She drove by Theodore's law office and the hospital where her daughter Rose was born. Home was still the house her mother had owned. She had made a lot of changes, like a new kitchen and updated bathrooms. She replaced the old furnace and air conditioner, but she was careful to keep the things that held memories. The old, lumpy couch was gone, but Rose's favorite armchair stayed. The sugary cereals were gone, replaced by healthier options. But the pantry remained perfectly neat, just how her mother always kept it. The emerald green silk scarf was now framed in a display case on the wall. The needlepoint sampler her mother made was hanging in baby Rose's room. The apple pie recipe was in a frame on the kitchen wall. Some things were just too precious to change. Ellie quietly carried her sleeping daughter inside. She dressed her in pajamas and gently laid her in the crib. The baby sighed and then fell into a deep, peaceful sleep. Ellie just stood there, watching her breathe. This perfect little girl was born from the worst time in her life. This beautiful child would grow up knowing her own story, every part of it. There would be no secrets, no hidden money, and no mysteries about where she came from. Rose would know everything, the good and the bad, the triumphs and the betrayals. She would know about the grandmother she was named for and the father who was not worthy of her. She would get to make her own choices, her own mistakes, and her own life. That was what real freedom looked like. Ellie went to the kitchen to make some tea. The kettle began to whistle. She poured the hot water over chamomile and a spoon of honey the same way her mother had made it for herself every night. Some nightly habits were too comforting to give up. Earlier, Charlie had gently asked if she was dating anyone, if she was ready to move on. Ellie just smiled. Maybe someday, she thought. Perhaps she would meet a man who deserved her trust, someone who saw her for who she was, not for what she had. He would have to love her daughter as much as she did. But that day was not today. She was still figuring out the woman she was becoming, And she was in no rush. She had all the time in the world, she had financial security, and she had her freedom. For now, it was more than enough. Just then, her phone buzzed. It was Theodore. He apologized for calling so late, but said he had news she needed to hear right away. The charitable foundations her mother had set up were now officially under her control. She was now in charge of over $2 billion in annual donations. $2 billion every single year that supported hospitals, orphanages, scholarships, and shelters. "What do I do now?" Ellie asked. "Whatever you want," he said. "You can continue your mother's work, or you can find new causes to support. The power to direct all of it is now in your hands. I want to continue her work, but I also want to create something of my own." "What are you thinking of?" Theodore asked. Ellie looked at the old apple pie recipe hanging in the worn wooden frame Rose had loved so much. She wanted to create new programs for adopted children. She imagined services to help them find their birth parents and to support those who could not. She thought about mental health services designed just for the challenges that adopted kids often face. Theodore was silent for a moment. "Your mother would be so proud of that idea," he finally said in a soft voice. "I am absolutely sure of it." After the call, Ellie sat down in Rose's favorite armchair. The house was quiet, her tea was warm, and the clock on the wall ticked softly. She thought about the crazy past year. The funeral, the unbelievable discovery in the bathroom, the letter that changed everything, all the meetings with lawyers, the hard work, the shocking truth, and how much she had changed. She thought about Grant, who had thrown her away and then lost everything. She thought of Vivian, whose terrible betrayal left her with nothing. She thought of Lorraine, who turned on her and now barely sees her own grandchild. She thought of Rose, the amazing private woman who hid a $1 trillion fortune just so her daughter would be loved for herself, not for her wealth. And then she thought about baby Rose. The baby was sleeping peacefully in her room, her whole future stretching out like a clear and open road. Ellie then thought of herself, who she was before and who she was now. This is not a new start, she thought. This is the real beginning. It was a simple, powerful truth. Everything that happened before this moment was just practice. Her marriage, her so-called friendships, the life she had built was nothing but a fragile house of cards. This was her actual start. This was the person she was truly meant to become. She was no longer Grant's wife or Vivian's friend. She was more than just Rose's daughter, though that would always be part of her. She was simply Ellie, stronger, wounded, and finally, completely free. She finished her tea, checked on her sleeping baby, and went to bed. She was staying in her old childhood room, now updated but still filled with happy memories. Sleep came to her much more easily these days. The nightmares were gone, the constant anxiety had faded, and the cycle of betrayal that once haunted her thoughts had finally stopped. She dreamed she was in the kitchen with her mother, and they were baking pies. Rose was teaching her to flute the edges of the crust, her hands moving with a smooth, certain skill. "You did it," Rose whispered in the dream. "You found your own strength." Ellie shook her head. "No, you are the one who gave it to me." Rose offered a gentle, knowing smile. "It was always yours, my dear. I just helped you find it." The morning sun began to fill the room as it peeked through the blinds. In her crib, baby Rose started to coo, announcing she was ready for a new day and her breakfast. Ellie climbed out of bed. She tended to her daughter first, then made herself some coffee using her mother's special mug. A quick look at her calendar revealed a full schedule of meetings, important choices, and wonderful new beginnings. She felt a sense of calm readiness. Outside on the porch, a soft breeze made the wind chimes play their sweet song. Her mother had cherished those chimes. She hung them on the very first day she moved in, 33 years before. They were still playing their tune, just as beautiful, and a constant presence. They reminded Ellie of her mother's legacy and her unconditional love. With her coffee mug in hand, Ellie stepped out onto the porch. The autumn morning was bathed in a warm, golden light as the world around her started to wake up. She could hear a dog barking in the distance and the happy sounds of children walking to school. She watched the silver chimes as they glittered and swayed in the breeze. Mom, I truly hope that I have made you proud, she said softly to the air. The wind chimes seemed to answer with their lovely music, and Eleanor Whitmore, the new inheritor of a fortune she never expected and the loving mother to a beautiful little girl, smiled. She had weathered a terrible betrayal that was meant to destroy her, and she smiled because she was finally at peace with the answer, a truth she had carried in her heart all along. If this story connected with you or made you reflect on your own experiences, we would be so grateful to hear from you in the comments section. We promise to read every single one. Do you believe Eleanor made the right decision? How would you have handled her situation? We invite you to share your own perspective with us below. And if our stories speak to you, the subscribe button is there for you to join us. Become a member of our community of inspiring women who always encourage each other, no matter what they face. Press the like button if you believe that finding happiness is the truest form of success. And please pass this story along to someone who might need a little bit of hope in their day. We share new videos every week that tell stories of resilience, fairness, and the incredible strength women have to rebuild their lives. We are excited to have you with us for the next one. Final message. Our team invests a great deal of thought into the research, creation, and careful editing of our content to bring meaningful lessons and helpful insights to our viewers. The purpose behind every story we share is clear: to inspire, provide comfort, and empower women from every background. Thank you for being such a wonderful and essential part of our community.